Chapter 5. In this chapter, we're going to begin to really understand the Bible and how it came to be. These are the objectives for your chapter. Please review them, and hopefully by the end of the chapter, these are all of the things that you will know. Here are your vocab words. Please be familiar with them and their definition. Please notice that when we are talking about sacred tradition, we are talking about tradition with a capital T. When we begin to look at how our Bible was constructed, we need to remember again that it began as an oral tradition. And each of these stories were influenced by the way the person talked and who the audience was. Just as when you tell a story, you are going to tell a story very differently, whether you're talking to your grandmother, your mother, or your friend. The things you include, the things you exclude. It doesn't change the point of the story, it just changes by the audience, who you are talking to and how you want them to see the story. So it was with sacred scripture. And as these stories were spread, they were passed down from generation to generation. And the most important part of the stories was that it was a faith story and how God's relationship with these people, the Hebrews, the chosen people, how their relationship was between them and God. And that was the most important thing, the faith story involved. Not all of the little details, but rather the faith story. When we look at the canon, we have both the Old Testament and New Testament canon. The Old Testament canon was written as an expression of the faith of the Israelites between the relationship between them and God, as God being God's chosen people. When we look at the New Testament, we have the stories of the apostles and their relationship with Jesus, and passing again on the oral traditions. And then slowly these oral traditions began to be written down when the letters and the different accounts of the gospel were all compiled. And they took these stories and it ultimately became the New Testament canon. And the word canon means ruler, as in a measure. How did these books measure up? How did we decide the 73 books, 46 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament? How did they decide which ones were going to be canonical? There was a very specific criteria about how these books would be chosen. And, the first thing was the community sense that it reflected the revelation of God. And did this story really talk about the Jews and their relationship with God, how God was active in their life, and how God's presence changed the course of their life? And was it a true expression of their faith? Did it really tell the real faith story between them and God? And if it did not, it was not deemed to be part of the sacred scripture. The Old Testament began about 4,000 years ago to be written down, to be collected in these stories, but it was finally written down, moving from oral tradition into a written tradition during the reign of King David, because you remember, this was a time of peace and prosperity, and the Jews were able to settle down. There were people who were able to write, people who knew how to write and had the ability to write. That was a very special skill, and very few people had that ability. And so they needed to be able to sit still and spend time and collect the stories. And so this is when it happened. And over time, some of these writings were deemed as canonical, that they really conveyed stories between God and the Jews. And Catholics took the longer Greek translation of the Jewish scripture. And the reason there were two translations is because, in the end, as these Jews were conquered by the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, they were dispersed and spread out across all of the Middle East. And there was a large Jewish population that only spoke Greek. And they used their scriptures, and it was called the Septuagint. And that was the Greek translation. And that is what the Catholic Church took as being the books that we would include as canonical in our Old Testament. And they were finally accepted as the Old Testament at the Council of Trent in 1546. And the New Testament is the same way. Began as oral traditions after the ascension of Jesus. The apostles went around, spread the good news, and it was only slowly that these same stories went from oral tradition to be written down. And it began with the letters of St. Paul and the apostles, and St. Paul writing to the early church and communicating with them about how to stay true to the faith, how to follow Jesus, letters of encouragement. And the first gospel was not written until about 60 CE, and it was written by Mark. And they decided to write them down because they knew that these stories were going to be lost, because as the apostles and the first eyewitnesses began to die off, they realized if they did not start to write these stories down, that the stories would be lost. And again, they each wrote in their own style and to their own audience. And remember, Mark is the first gospel to be written, John is the last. And these were not written by the apostles that carry the names such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. No one knows the exact, for sure, person or persons that wrote the Gospels. And here are the rules for the canonical writings. This is also in your textbook. I'm going to stop here. Please review these because they will come back to be discussed.